Go. Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today for our press briefing on menthol and the plight of African Americans in the United States, and also what's happening with some of our African brothers and sisters across the Atlantic. So this press briefing, when people ask, what's the sound bite? There is no sound bite because this is a problem that merits deep discussion and helping people to really understand the history of the predatory targeting that African Americans have faced in this country. And as there's a lot of conversation now about Juul and vaping and lawsuits for precious white teenagers that I love, but there wasn't anything happening like that when menthol cigarettes were being given to black children in this country for free, not just enticing them to buy, but actually physically giving them free cigarettes. So we're going to just go around the world with all of these issues. Our position is that many of the things that we've experienced in this country with the predation, actually, we deserve to be in a protected class, and we deserve some special remedies as we're moving forward, okay? So I'm the co-chair of the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council. We were formed, we're 10 years old now, going on 11 this year, having some growing pains as we get towards adolescence. But we are based in California, but we've been on the national scene since President Obama signed the Tobacco Control Act, and Dr. Phil Gardner is going to talk a little bit more about that. But I just want to start us off with someone who most of you know, who is the youngest person that I know that received these cigarettes, and so we're going to need the audio.
Walking in Metro Center in D.C. They was doing a promotion. They gave me a pack of cigarettes.
At Metro Center.
I was 14 years old. Ooh. Now, I got to tell you, I probably looked really young. So if anything ever happens to me smoking related, oh, I'm coming for it. I'm coming like the limey.
But you smoked it and you were like, oh, this is delightful.
Yeah, I was ill, man. I was even crazier than that. I took the cigarettes home and it was sitting on my dress, and I was like, and I literally said to myself, you know what? I'm gonna learn how to smoke. And like comedy stuff, I didn't realize I'd get so good at it.
Because at first.
So that's a prime example of what we're talking about. And Dave Chappelle is the child of two professors. So he's from a highly educated family. And as he said, he went home and said he was going to learn how to smoke. I'm a big fan of his, and when you see him perform, he smokes all the time. He can't last very long without bumming a cigarette, oftentimes from the audience. So when African Americans, when we look at our issues, our problems, we want our people and our elected officials and public health folks to know that tobacco kills more black people than everything else. And so when you look at this graph, homicides get a lot of attention. I travel all over the country, and wherever I go, when I turn on the radio or television, they're telling me which brown or black man was killed the night before. But for every brown or black man that's been murdered, there are about 6 to 8 adults who are dying at home from tobacco-caused diseases. And even AIDS is now a chronic disease that people can live and survive and have healthy lives if they take care of themselves and take their medicine. So those are the stats that we talk about. I often compare the criminal justice system with our public health policy system, and we're going to talk about some of the oversights and shortfalls when it comes to protecting black folks. But on the criminal justice side, you have politicians and police officers and judges and court clerks and prosecutors and bailiffs and correctional officers and parole officers, activists, and you have a lot of human suffering. And in sick communities, you have bureaucrats, researchers, politicians, health insurance, health delivery systems, public health departments, health disparity pimps, activists, and a lot of human suffering. So in one, we're the defendant, and one, we're the patient. And that has to change. Both of those things have to change, our criminal justice system and our public health policy system. So this is another graph that's just comparing smoking with homicide, so you can see that smoking is a huge, big problem, much greater than homicides. And also breast cancer gets a lot of support, and there are all kinds of institutions. My mother died of breast cancer, so there's Susan G. Komen, there's the Run, there's the Pink Ribbon, but actually almost twice as many women die from lung cancer than breast cancer. And they usually are smokers, the vast majority. They're ashamed many times because they feel that they brought their disease on themselves, and they're just not getting the support that breast cancer victims do. And so that's also something that's an issue. So as we go around our community with the many different issues that we have, we want folks to know that tobacco control policy is not just something that people who don't have any real problems do to make themselves useful. This is a huge problem, and we want it to be in our top 5 priorities. Chemistry and access equals addiction. Black people, as we see with the opioid epidemic and the different way that that's been treated than crack or heroin, which were more people of color. But anytime an entity that's addictive has access to people, they become addicted. So we've seen that with the vaping epidemic with our teenagers across this country. So it's about chemistry and access, and we're about disrupting access. And we're also about decreasing demand by educating our people and letting them know what has happened to them over these past 50 years. So right now I'm going to bring up Dr. Phil Gardner. He is my other half, the co-chair. I'm his better half. And he's going to talk to you about the history.
Thank you, Carol. How well said. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
What brings us here today is 60 years of predatory marketing of flavored tobacco products, specifically menthol, in the Black community. This is no mistake. The tobacco industry did it on purpose. This wasn't inadvertent. This wasn't an unintended consequence. This was intended. They did it purposely, and they did it maliciously. Let me suggest to you that it's been over the last 60 years, since the 1950s, the 1960s. You might look at it this way, that the rates of tobacco use, menthol, I hit something. Okay. The rates of menthol use among African Americans in 1953 was 5%. By 1968, it had jumped to 14%. By 1976, it had tripled to 42%. Today, 85% of African American adult smokers smoke menthol cigarettes, and 94% of African American youths who smoke menthol cigarettes. Where did this come from? This came from the predatory marketing of these tobacco products, what Carol started this with, of giving these things away to kids. Let's be honest about it. What is predatory marketing? Let's be concrete. Menthol cigarettes in the African American community, there are more advertisements for them. They're more at a child's level in terms of eye contact. There are greater promotions. Instead of buy one, get 2 free, you can buy 2 and get 3 free. And I guess what is most upsetting about this, and we have data from both sides of the United States, is that menthol cigarettes are cheaper in the African American community. This is the whole idea they're doing it. So what is this all about? What is menthol all about? Menthol at bottom allows the poisons and toxins in cigarettes to go down easier. That's why it's put in there. It masks the harsh taste of tobacco. It acts as an anesthetic. It cools the throat, allows for deeper inhalation. The deeper you inhale, the more toxins you intake. The more toxins you intake and the more nicotine you intake, the more addicted you become. The more addicted you become, it becomes harder to quit. This is why African Americans, and I think Carol started our stuff with that, die disproportionately of tobacco-related diseases. This is no mistake. The information I just told you, we learned from the tobacco industry about what they do. Menthol also does another thing in terms of nicotine metabolism. It slows down the metabolism of nicotine in the body, meaning it stays in your body longer. And as Dr. Valerie Yerger will tell you, coupled with that, if you have melanin in your skin, which gives color to you, melanin stores nicotine. So here you have a product that allows nicotine to stay in your body longer, and if you're Black, it stays in your body longer anyway. Okay? The tobacco industry is thoroughly aware of that. I see we have a picture of my colleague, Karen Bass, who stood with us and stands with us in the fight against menthol. She couldn't be here this morning, but we worked with her in the past, and we worked with her yesterday, and we will work with her in the future. And hopefully she was somebody we can turn to in this fight. Let's be clear, what we are asking, one of the asks that we are making, and we'll get to the legal side of it later in the discussion, The FDA has failed over the last 10 years to do anything about menthol. State governments have failed over the last 10 years to do anything about menthol. When the 13 flavors were restricted by the Family Smoking Prevention Act of 2009, the only thing left in was menthol. And of course, African Americans disproportionately use menthol, so this is a problem. The AATCLC has worked now at the local level to actually get citywide restrictions put in place around the country. I guess the highlight, and we'll talk more about this later, is Proposition E in San Francisco, which outlawed the sale of these products citywide. Remember, it's the sale that was outlawed, not the possession that was outlawed. We are working in cities around the country to get this done. We want you to join us in this fight in taking this up. Let me just say that that in the future, and maybe the future is now, we've all been talking about the Juul explosion and these little thumb drive looking devices. It's not really just a Juul explosion, it's a flavors explosion. And at the center of the flavors explosion is menthol. So when we talk about getting rid of flavors, there should be no menthol exemptions whatsoever. There's a lot of people that still are talking about that we should do that. Let's not do that at all. With that, I want to thank you all for coming today. And if you take anything away from this, remember, menthol makes the poison go down easier, and we need to start at the local level in the fight against this. Thank you very much.
And you can just advance a few to her, please. Advance a few slides.
Oh, these are some kitties. So our next speaker is going to be Sharon Eubanks, colleague and friend here in D.C., the litigator against the tobacco industry, is going to give you chapter and verse of how to arrest these people, how to try these people.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Sharon Eubanks. I want to take you back to 1999, when the United States filed its lawsuit against the tobacco industry, alleging 50 years of fraud. After a 9-month trial, Judge Gladys Kessler in the district court here in the District of Columbia concluded as a matter of law that the tobacco companies were racketeers, having engaged in a fraud upon the American people about the harms of smoking and the harms of secondhand smoke. Now, her decision was in 2006. Just for the record, so you know, that case only ended last year. Those were the appeals that take place. When you take on this industry, you have to be prepared to go the distance in the lawsuits till the end of the earth. It can be done, and it can be done successfully. So there's much more here. The lawsuit uncovered that facts that demonstrated that the industry targeted African Americans, big surprise, with menthol cigarettes. The documents that came to light in the tobacco litigation revealed several things, to wit, Big Tobacco identified, targeted, and profiled Black communities. They appropriated Black culture. This addiction was all by design and intent. Menthol makes up a large portion of the U.S. cigarette market at 35% in 2016. About 89% of African Americans who smoke menthol brands. Menthol makes cigarettes, as Dr. Phil told us, easier to smoke and harder to quit. The tobacco industry has a well-documented history of developing and marketing mentholated brands to racial and ethnic minorities and to youth. Evidence from their own documents, industry documents, shows that the industry studied smokers' menthol preferences and then went one step further to manipulate the content of menthol in these cigarettes to make them more likely to be purchased by certain parts of certain members of our community, the Black community, minorities, children. Indeed, evidence from the tobacco industry documents shows that tobacco companies specifically, intentionally, by design, targeted African Americans with excessive menthol cigarette advertising, an overabundance of ads in publications that appeal to African American audiences, billboards in African American communities, points of sale where African Americans shopped, all of the advertisements that were targeting it, showing African Americans having a good time with their cigarettes, made people want to be that way. They thought that cigarette brought that to them. In 2009, the FDA was granted regulatory authority over the cigarettes. Now I'm going to go back again. It's 2009. That's 10 years ago. They were granted regulatory authority. It has been 10 long years since the FDA was given that authority to act on mentholated products. Now, mind you, the legislation as it was put forward banned flavors except menthol. So they certainly have the authority, the FDA does, the federal government, with the process that's set forth in the statute, but that hasn't happened yet. There is no ban on menthol cigarettes. To be sure, there's no good reason not to ban the entire product. Certainly, you could ban mentholated cigarettes. Canada has imposed a ban on menthol cigarettes. I thought the U.S. was first in everything, but now Canada, ahead of us, they've done that. The EU has a ban that goes into place in next year, in 2020. San Francisco imposed a ban on menthol cigarettes. It can be done. What is the FDA waiting for? Does our government not care about the high percentage of African Americans who become addicted to menthol cigarettes? Does it not care about youth initiation of smoking with using menthol cigarettes? Menthol makes the product feel less harsh, and it makes the body absorb more nicotine. That means it's easier to start and harder to quit. The failure to include menthol in the legislation in 2009 when the Tobacco Control Act was passed with the other flavors, that was a mistake. I know I wrote an article about that many years ago before the legislation was passed. Lives were lost because of this huge error. Perhaps Joe Califano, former Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, which is now HHS, said it best at the time, and I quote, "The legislation was clearly putting black children in the back of the bus," end quote. Last year, the FDA announced that it would go forward with a ban on menthol. That's great news, better late than never. Unmistakably, the FDA will have a fight and a long war, but it will be on the right side of that issue. Menthol cigarettes should become history, and the FDA has the regulatory authority to make it so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and we're so glad that you could be with us today. And this is my slide that I use, that the tobacco industry, they are federally adjudicated racketeers, that Sharon Eubanks was the lead on this case. No better than the Sopranos, except they're incorporated, so there's never anyone personally responsible for the harm that they do. Nobody's going to jail. Next, we're going to bring up our NAPTN partners, the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council. We are a proud affiliate of NAPTN, and we have with us today Shantae Keith and LaTroya Hester, who are just going to talk about NAPTN's role.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Shantae Keith, and I'm the Director of Programs for NAPTN, Inc., that stands for the National African American Tobacco Prevention Network. First, I would like to just thank the AATCLC for coordinating this briefing. Thank you for having us. Thank you to the distinguished speakers that are here this morning, as well as all of you that are joining us in the audience, as well as via live stream. I wanted to talk briefly this morning about the role that NAPTN has played over the course of 20 years in addressing menthol. NAPTN is a national nonprofit that addresses the disparate impact that tobacco use has had on African Americans. We are also a network that is comprised of state tobacco and cancer programs, faith-based institutions, community-based organizations, higher learning institutions, advocates, and legislators that are committed to health justice and are willing to work with us for policy solutions that improve the health of our communities, particularly policies that support the removal of menthol cigarettes from marginalized communities. Napton has been a part of some of the most important movements in tobacco control, including in 2009 when the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act was signed into law, which gave the U.S. Food and Drug Administration the authority to regulate tobacco products. As previously mentioned, this act has also made the sale of most flavored additives, including fruit and candy flavoring, illegal in order to protect youth and young adults. However, as also mentioned, the law exempted menthol-flavored cigarettes. Again, this law exempted menthol-flavored cigarettes, a flavor, mind you, that is the most popular among young people and African Americans. Menthol's exclusion from the list of banned flavorings prompted 7 former secretaries of health, including Drs. Joseph Califano and Louis Sullivan, and former surgeon generals, to write a joint letter with us, the National African American Tobacco Control Prevention Network, that adamantly opposed the exclusion of menthol from the list of banned flavors. Because this law blatantly ignored that menthol is dangerous flavor that strongly poses a threat to young people and communities of color, there was public outcry. As Sharon mentioned, Dr. Califano stated that the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, as written, relegated black children to the back of the back of the bus. Excuse me, I just want to say, he said the back of the bus, but I want to say the public health bus. The public outcry led to an amendment of the law that was initiated and co-authored by Congresswoman Donna Christensen and the Congressional Black Caucus, being added to the legislation. This amendment mandated that the issue of mentholated cigarettes be given top priority by the newly formed TPSAC, the Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Committee, that was also commissioned by the FDA. Since that time, Napton has continued to petition the FDA to act on menthol by authoring several letters in partnership with other organizations to call on the FDA to do the right thing and to restrict menthol cigarettes. Napton has also made public comments in cities like Chicago, New Orleans, and just recently, earlier this week in Atlanta, advocating for smoke-free environments and healthier communities. Our organization has trained numerous youth on menthol and how they are being aggressively marketed to by the tobacco industry. Napton has built relationships at the national, state, and local level to partner and collaborate with those that stand for health justice and recognize that menthol cigarettes is a hindrance to the health of our communities. And until the FDA concretely takes action and remove all menthol products from the shelves, Napton will remain vigilant in fighting for policy solutions that keep youth, young adults, and marginalized communities protected from menthol and secondhand smoke. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to LaTroya Hester, who will talk more about some important Napton-led movements.
Thank you, Shantae. Today, this room is full of experts, researchers, and decision makers who understand the history and technical aspects of menthol and its public health impact. But it does not take 20 years, as a 20-year veteran in this industry, to recognize the social injustice associated with the predatory, targeted marketing of a product that has been normalized and is causing death in our community, especially when we think about its newest imposter, Juul, and e-cigarettes that they think can slide under the radar. Well, African Americans have always been frontline and watchful when it comes to injustice. Our community leaders have been faithful in providing education and inspiration necessary to launch grassroots movements and marches across the country. When it comes to menthol, our leaders, especially our faith leaders and our pastors, have been fired up. Just last week, we observed No Menthol Sunday, which is Napton's annual observance day designed to get churches and congregations talking about tobacco addiction in the African American community and the role that menthol plays. As soon as people hear about No Menthol Sunday, they go into direct action. They start praying for one another. They start doing prayer walks. They start getting their youth involved in parades. They start making announcements in their church about the ill effect of mentholated tobacco product. But more importantly, they get together and they take a stand against the tobacco industry, and they begin supporting policy solutions. If the churches who participated in No Menthol Sunday just last week were in this room, there would be more than 20,000 people in this room representing more than 30 states. You see, support for healthier environments can be found in Black communities all across the country. We battle major injustices in our neighborhoods, and we have had it. No Menthol Sunday is a clear example that communities are eager to educate one another and stand against forces that don't have our best interests in mind. Pastors have led with strong and credible voices, and they're helping us to take our message neighborhood by neighborhood to place restrictions on mentholated tobacco products, because we want our families and our young people to have the privilege of living in a city that actually values our health. While we commend the FDA for their proposal to ban menthol nationwide, we will continue to lead this movement city by city until the work is finally done. We have recently published a letter demonstrating our intention to continue this local level action and to speak in one voice and remain in solidarity with AATCLC and organizations like it. We are pleased to announce that the NAACP has signed on to this letter, and we welcome anyone else who will take seriously this fight against the tobacco industry and other pushers of products that do not benefit our health and well-being. A copy of this letter is available to everyone in this room and any press who would like to cover the issue. Again, we thank you for your time, and our contact information will be on the screen.
Thank you, Napton, and we are so happy that we're together in this because it takes all of us. And I just want to also just reiterate what LaTroya said, that our regular people, our communities, they get it. When we talk about menthol, people, you can see a light go off because they know they've lived it. And if they haven't personally smoked these cigarettes, they know their family members have, and they can remember back when Newport advertising was out and how that made them feel for us to be seen at all in an advertisement. It appears that my PowerPoint is stuck. Okay. So that's the contact information, and that will be on the archive. Okay, so that's our Napton. So this is, an international issue. This is an abstract that we submitted actually at a world conference on tobacco health in Singapore. And so we have been taking our plight around the world as how we are treated as African Americans around these issues. And these are some of the things that Dr. Valerie Yerger will be covering. But we want to now switch and talk about the international implications. And so I also talk about that African American communities are like underdeveloped African countries in the confines of the United States, the richest country in the world, and that our issues are very similar to our brothers and sisters in Africa. Issues around economic development, racism or oppression for our brothers and sisters in Africa, post-colonialization, police brutality, stress on our end, chronic diseases, AIDS, poverty, violence, housing, and I also switched political instability and war on our side as well. And then in Africa, so that neither one of these communities can afford to become addicted to these products and spend our income and buy death and disease. So right now I'm going to bring up Laurent Hubert, who with ASH, who has championed the international issues. What's been done to us in this country is in violation of many human rights treaties and human treaties for women and children, and he's going to talk about that.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. My name is Laurent Hubert, and I'm the Executive Director of Action on Smoking and Health and Ambassador for the Framework Convention Alliance, organizations that have worked on global issues related to health and tobacco control. And I'm going to very quickly just, this PowerPoint. It's complicated, actually. For sake of time, I won't bother. I think I can do without it. And the global community is very, very aware of the impact menthol has on health and adding menthol to cigarettes. What's not quite as well known, though, is globally, for people who are not from the United States, is the impact it has particularly on African Americans. And it's anecdotally, as I was walking in, there were two young women smoking, and I could smell it. It was menthol cigarettes. And my point, what I really want to stress, is that there are a number of international global health agreements and human rights agreements and treaties that the United States has participated and even ratified in some cases, where really this issue actually of selling menthol cigarettes, and particularly impact has on African Americans, is a violation of those norms and those treaties. The first one is the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the first global health treaty negotiated under the auspices of the World Health Organization. And the United States was a full participatory in those treaty negotiations and went on to sign on to this treaty in 2004. It has not yet ratified this treaty. However, by signing on the treaty, it has committed to its principles and the principles of the treaty. And the treaty, in one of its guidelines, states very specifically that countries, parties to the treaty, should regulate by prohibiting or restricting ingredients that may be used to increase palatability in tobacco products, including menthol. As Dr. Gardner said, menthol makes the poison go easy. So clearly, this is counter the part of the treaty by continuing selling menthol cigarettes. In addition, menthol cigarettes being cheaper in African American communities, it also goes against the principles of the treaty where tobacco products should be expensive to make it less available to vulnerable populations such as children. Even the advertising of the products, the fact that it's advertised more prominently in African American communities, again, something that is in total violation of the principle of the treaty. So every day menthol cigarettes remain on the shelves in stores in the United States, the US is falling further behind the global best practices associated with this treaty. So there we have this treaty, that's one element. Then in 2011, there was the second UN, the United Nations high-level meeting on health. There had been one in 2000 on HIV/AIDS. The second one was in 2011 to address the issue of non-communicable diseases, cancer, cardiovascular disease, chronic lung diseases, things that clearly affect the African American population. And this UN political declaration, which the US signed on and adopted with the rest of the countries that are members to the United Nations, call on an accelerated implementation of this tobacco treaty. Again, something that the United States is not doing by not removing menthol from the shelves in the United States. Further along, in May 2014, the United States was part of the negotiating countries that developed a global action plan to address the problem of non-communicable diseases and to live up to the commitments of the political declaration that had been adopted in 2011. And this global action plan calls on a 30% reduction on tobacco use, but for every country between 2010 and 2025. If we don't remove menthol cigarettes from shelves in the United States, will the African American communities where menthol is being used, will they benefit from this 30% reduction? Probably not. So again, another violation in some extent to a commitment that the United States has made to this global NCD, action plan on NCDs. Then in September 2015, the United States was one among the countries that adopted the UN United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals have become the to-do list for the entire world, and they ask for countries to reduce premature mortality and death and disease related to non-communicable diseases, cancer, cardiovascular, chronic lung diseases, and call on countries to also implement the FCTC. Again, by continuing to sell flavored menthol cigarettes, which affect particularly a segment of the population, the United States is not living to the commitments it made to the UN General Assembly. And I do want to state the statements that President Obama made on the day these SDGs were adopted. He said, "Poverty, growing inequality exist in all of our nations, and all our nations have work to do, and that includes here in the United States." And he went on to say, "I'm committing the United States to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals." So obviously, this is something that is critical to the United States. Also then through other UN agreements, the United States had been part of the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council, and was one of the members of which is the principal body that monitors progress being made at national level towards human rights commitments. And in 2017, only 2 years ago, in July, almost 2 years from, it's coming up in July, there was a resolution that was adopted unanimously and called on all countries to do all they need to do to achieve the SDG targets related to health, and also clearly accelerate the implementation of the FCTC. So again, a commitment that the United States made to an international human rights body, and it's clearly not yet done the steps it needs to do to fully address that issue. In September 2017, the United States at the Pan American Sanitary Conference, which is the meeting of health ministers from all around the Americas, the United States, among all of the countries of the Americas, so the continents of the Americas, from Canada all the way down to Chile and Argentina, adopted a strategy and plan of action to strengthen tobacco control in the regions of the America. And the plan states that the FCTC, the Tobacco Treaty, and its guideline are the basis for the development and implementation of tobacco control policies, and are key to meeting the target of a 30% reduction in the prevalence of tobacco use. That includes also in the United States. Again, the FCTC, the Tobacco Treaty, which calls for a ban on all flavorings, and particularly menthol, and that is absolutely key to protecting African Americans from the tobacco epidemic. And in addition, the United States doesn't ratify a lot of international treaties, but it has ratified the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and under which the government has a duty to address wide racial disparities, and should obviously include menthol in this, as the use and impact of tobacco products has a clear impact on the African American population. So again, in this case, by not addressing the menthol issue, the U.S. is violating the right to health, which is recognized in the Convention Against Racial Discrimination. So clearly, menthol cigarettes are an obstacle to all of those global agreements that the U.S. has endorsed, or even in some cases ratified. And by not taking action on menthol, it suggests that U.S. jurisdictions are more concerned about preserving the profits of big tobacco corporations than the health of their African American citizens. Dr. Gardner and so one of the speakers also mentioned the fact that it's this point that communities, the fight is taken community to community, and that needs to also be taken by the FDA, because all Americans and all African Americans must be protected from the tobacco and the predatory behaviors of the tobacco industry. Selling a product that is addictive and lethal when used as intended, and manipulated by adding menthol in it to be more attractive and make the poison go down more easily, and it's particularly having an impact on a particular population within the United States, is a violation of the right to health and life of African Americans in the United States. So I very much call on America to do all they need to do to protect all of its citizens. Thank you.
Would you introduce Dr. Flavia?
Yes.
We're going to pull our video up there.
I'd like to introduce Dr. Flavia Sekunbuge, who's from South Africa and has been recognized as one of the leading African doctors, and we're very, very lucky to have her on our side, and who's been, was the chair of the big global tobacco control conference, the World Conference on Tobacco or Health, and she was the president for the conference at the last conference that took place in South Africa. And thanks to her work, we were able to send a declaration that was adopted on tobacco and health to the Human Rights Council.
Merci beaucoup. And I just want to also say that I've been working internationally. In San Francisco in 1996, we had one of the first global summits on tobacco in this country. And I was married to a man from West Africa. I've traveled all over Africa and have seen the advertising in Senegal. They had a brand of cigarettes called Houston, USA, with billboards of African Americans to entice young African youth to be like us and to smoke. So this is Dr. Flavia, and she's sent us a message, a video.
Hello, my name is Dr. Flavia Sekunbuge. I'm a specialist public health medicine physician, and I work at the University of Pretoria as the head of health policy and management. I was also the president of the World Conference on Tobacco Health, which is abbreviated WCTOH, in 2018. This conference was held for the first time in Africa last year. I'm so delighted to be part of this press briefing, and even more delighted to be part of this all-important topic that will discuss menthol cigarettes, particularly in the African American population. We first have to understand the impact of tobacco use in general. So we know, first of all, that tobacco use really affects the global economic agenda and also the global economic cost. And it nearly costs $2 million or $2 trillion and 2% of the world's GDP. And this is according to the recent statistics. But more importantly is understanding the mechanism of how menthol and why menthol is so dangerous. So menthol really increases the nicotine receptor density in the brain, and therefore making it more addictive than unflavored cigarettes. Additional to this, though, we do know that menthol also inhibits nicotine metabolism, and therefore increases the systemic availability of nicotine in the body, and therefore a person becomes addictive in that way. But this mechanism is important, yes, but it's more starking if you actually think about the fact that 80% of young people who use menthol cigarettes will likely become lifelong smokers as compared to those who use unflavored cigarettes. Now, if you think about the fact that the use of menthol cigarettes affects the African American population and Africans disproportionately, in addition to this, knowing that even with other conditions, Africans are affected disproportionately, it becomes very important to articulate clearly and send out a message clearly that this indeed is a human rights violation. Particularly if you consider that most countries in the world, including the United States, have actually signed the United Nations Convention Against Racial Discrimination. We therefore, and I would personally like to call on the fact that we need to put this front and center of the global agenda, and not only look at it in terms of just the use of menthol cigarettes, but really the fact that the continued use of menthol cigarettes affects a particular population and exacerbates health disparities. There is absolutely no ways that you will achieve the Sustainable Development Goal. There's no ways that you can achieve a Sustainable Development Agenda in any country if you continue to have a particular population being discriminated against when you consider the use of menthol cigarettes. During the 2018 conference, we signed a very important and called upon all parties, and we called it the Cape Town Declaration on Human Rights and a Tobacco-Free World. During that conference, the theme was Uniting the World Against a Tobacco-Free Generation. And as such then, we cannot unite nor have a tobacco-free generation with the continued use of menthol cigarettes in various populations, which we know, again, I want to reiterate, are disparaging among particularly Africans and African Americans. And so I would like to say that it is very important that countries adopt the Cape Town Declaration on Human Rights and put tobacco control as a human rights agenda. Because in Africa we say, umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. I am because we are. There is no way, again, I want to say, that we can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, nor be able to achieve our aspirations of the FCTC if we leave certain populations, and in this case, Africans, out of the health agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Flavia. And we're going to segue now to what are we going to do about this problem. But I also wanted to point out that British American Tobacco, which now owns Newport Cigarettes, they have done everything they can to blunt any kind of public health policy in Africa, including suing the country of Togo which is a small West African country that these countries cannot fight the industry, when Togo was trying to implement public health policies to protect their citizens. So they corrupt and they do all kinds of things, and now British American Tobacco has come to the Africans in America through when they purchased Newport cigarettes from Reynolds. Reynolds still has a big stake in it, and you'll see them as the mouthpiece for Newports, but British American Tobacco is the actual owner now. So we're going to bring Dr. Phil back up, and we're going to talk about what we're going to do.
Thank you, Carol.
You can address it after you introduce.
Okay. I'm gonna go off script here a little. I mentioned it to Carol. I'm gonna go 3 things off script before we talk about what we're gonna do. Firstly, and I appreciate the focus on the African American community. I've been in the Black liberation struggle since the 1960s, and I will dedicate the rest of my life to that. So this is not a question or an issue. But my sense is, and we all know this, is that menthol affects all sorts of people. It's not just about black people. Women disproportionately use menthol cigarettes, regardless of what race or ethnic group you are. If you're a smoker and you're a woman, you just 52% smoke menthol cigarettes. If you're Puerto Rican, 62% of Puerto Rican smokers smoke menthol cigarettes. If you're Filipino, somewhere in the neighborhood of 58% of Filipinos smoke menthol cigarettes. Native Hawaiians remind me of African Americans, okay? They smoke in the 80% menthol cigarettes. The LGBTQ community disproportionately smokes menthol cigarettes. A majority of gay and lesbian folks who smoke menthol cigarettes. Folks with mental health disorders disproportionately smoke menthol cigarettes. Are we getting a picture here? Groups that are marginalized on the side, on the end. Of course, African Americans at the core of it, but everybody else who's marginalized and on the edge are being targeted. And of course, the poor, folks with low SES. So I just want to keep this in mind. When we go around to different locales, it's important to actually bring these groups to play. And so when we talk about what we do about it, these are some of the people we do. Let me say a second thing that's off the script. I appreciate my colleagues calling out and saying the FDA said they're thinking about doing something about menthol, and then I would agree it's about time somebody said something about that. But let's be clear, they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. At the same time, they want to keep menthol and mint-flavored and spearmint in e-juices. And that's what the majority of kids are using. At the center of the flavor, the jewel flavor explosion, the FDA is talking about keeping menthol and spearmint and this stuff in, saying this will help adults quit. No, it'll just addict more adults. That's what this is about. So we will not relent on our fight with the FDA. And then lastly, before we move on, I want to give a shout out to a colleague in the audience, Amber Thornton, as I knew her, Bullock, who at American Legacy Foundation, which is now Truth, when it was early on, when it was the late 90s and early 2000s, Amber stood up on this issue. I could go to Amber. Wasn't even no AATCLC at that time. There were certain African Americans who understood that menthol was being disproportionately marketed to our community, and Amber was one of them. She became a champion for that. I want to recognize you, and let's give a shout out to Amber. Okay, back on script. So one of the things, and I'm going to ask Carol to come back up here. One of the things is that we can bring lawsuits against the tobacco industry. I know there are going to be people talking about, but they can be sued for personal damages. They can be sued for misadvertisement. What recently was done by Breathe DC to sue American Spirit is for, false advertising, saying these are healthier cigarettes, essentially. It only took a couple of years to get that decision made. Some of these suits will take years, literally, to go down, but it's something to keep in mind. Not only fight them at the local level, not only fight the FDA to move forward, but also bringing lawsuits that we can take this stuff up about. So you have to fight on all sides of the street when we're taking up this fight against menthol. I'm just going to use that as my introduction to Carol, and you can you should introduce her And I know there's other, what do you want to say, starlets in the audience, but I'm going to let Carol deal with that.
All right, next up is Ms. Natasha Phelps, who's with the Public Health Law Center. And we want to just really let the Public Health Law Center know how grateful we are. They've been with us for 10 years. Before we had any funding, they would send for us to come back to get our opinion and input as we move forward. And so we're just grateful. And poor people don't have any money, so if we don't have public health law centers, we can't get any legal advice on this. So we're going to talk about what we need to do and what's been done, what we can do moving forward. So Natasha.
Thank you. Hello, good morning. My name is Natasha Phelps. I'm a staff attorney at the Public Health Law Center, which is a nonprofit legal center located in St. Paul, Minnesota. We use the law and policy to help individuals, communities, and governments to improve public health across the country. And we know that effective public health law and policy are those that address the health inequities and disparities that devastate the public overall but impact marginalized communities the most. And as we've learned from scientists, the tobacco industry's own admissions, and the experienced, passionate leadership of our partners like the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council and the National African American Tobacco Prevention Network, addressing menthol-flavored tobacco products through law and policy is vital to addressing health disparities facing the Black community. We know that the tobacco industry has long taken advantage of institutional racism and wealth and economic inequality. We have seen them exploit the unfortunate lack of funding and resources for organizations and cultural entities representing Black, low-income, LGBTQ+ Americans in order to permeate communities with expertly tailored marketing, flood neighborhoods with poisonous products, and thwart evidence-based laws and policies that improve public health. The scale of the problem is so great, the harm so catastrophic, and the resulting disparities so unacceptable that we, as the Public Health Law Center, identify menthol-flavored tobacco as our commercial tobacco team's top priority. Today, I'm here to address what can be done to seek justice and to prevent this harm from happening in the first place. So I'll go over two important tools today: litigation and law and policy. Okay, so if you look at the slide, for those of you who don't know, this is a photo of Marie Evans. On the left, she is 10 years old, born in 1947 in Boston's Orchard Park housing project. At the time that photo was taken, she had been receiving free cigarettes for about a year from Lorillard Tobacco Company agents that set up shop in her neighborhood as a part of their strategy to market Newport, their brand of menthol-flavored cigarettes. They particularly targeted low-income Black children like Miss Evans with menthol cigarettes because, as we've heard today, menthol cigarettes are especially good at getting children hooked. At first, Miss Evans traded the free cigarettes for candy, but soon, attracted by their constant availability and packaging, she began smoking them herself and became addicted. As an adult, Miss Evans was so addicted that she needed to smoke 5 minutes after waking up in the morning. And while she heard that cigarettes could cause lung cancer, she also heard conflicting reports, likely from the industry, trying to keep people trying to stop smoking. But when Miss Evans suffered a heart attack at the young age of 38, she finally became convinced that smoking was bad for her health. She tried to quit more than 50 times over 16 years, but was never successful. Finally, at the age of 54, Miss Evans received the same diagnosis that took her father's life, terminal lung cancer. Miss Evans then sued Lorillard. She died 8 years before the lawsuit was won by her son. In this groundbreaking 2013 ruling, a jury found in favor of her son and her estate on all remaining claims under Massachusetts law. Following appeal and the denial of claims by Lorillard, the parties settled for $79 million for the Evans family estate. Okay, so now here are a few more individuals who were targeted and deceived by the tobacco industry and turned, again, to litigation for justice. These plaintiffs filed suit in the U.S. Virgin Islands in 2010. In 1960, 10-year-old Lucian Evans England, on the left, visited New York with his mother and became another intended target of Lorillard's nationwide marketing campaign. He found and took free sample packs of Newport cigarettes that were left on the doorknob of the Bronx Public Housing Project unit he and his mother were staying in. Around that same time, 16-year-old U.S. Virgin Islands resident Patrice Brown, on the right, was attending boarding school in Florida. She started smoking Newport cigarettes after seeing advertisements associating the cigarettes with a refreshing mint taste and the clear water of the Caribbean. The exposure to marketing and access to products caused Mr. England and Miss Brown to initiate tobacco addictions at a young age. This ultimately caused their premature deaths. Mr. Brown died of larynx cancer and tobacco-related bladder cancer, and Miss Brown died from lung cancer. But before their deaths, each plaintiff filed a lawsuit against Lorillard for claims similar to those raised in the Marie Evans case. Their cases were later merged, and R.J. Reynolds became a defendant following its 2015 purchase of Lorillard. Just like the case of Marie Evans, both plaintiffs died before the end of litigation, and their children that survived them took up their claims. In another landmark decision, the families of Mr. England and Miss Brown were awarded $113 million by 2 U.S. Virgin Island juries in 2018. So these 3 cases are the largest verdicts to date in individual tobacco litigation against the manufacturers of menthol-flavored cigarettes. All 3 lawsuits started with the tobacco industry luring and addicting children, particularly young Black children in low-income neighborhoods. Through the courage and resiliency of the plaintiffs and their children, some justice was achieved, even if after all of their deaths. So, to date, private litigation has provided justice for a few of those harmed by the industry's targeting with menthol. Litigation has also been used by the federal and state governments to hold the tobacco industry accountable. Years ago, as Sharon Eubanks described earlier, several cigarette manufacturers were found liable of violating federal racketeering statutes. And this litigation resulted in, again, more justice. But what can be done to address and prevent this damage and injustice from happening in the first place? So this is the second prong of what I want to talk to you about. Law and policy can create barriers to the harms of menthol-flavored products if they are effective. When President Obama signed the Tobacco Control Act into law in 2009, it inexcusably left out menthol from the list of flavored products, or the lists of flavored being allowed in cigarettes. This is an error Congress could have fixed at any point in the last 10 years, but they haven't. For the last 10 years, the FDA has had the authority to include menthol in the list of banned cigarette flavors, but they haven't, despite all this talk that we're hearing. Congress's failure for failing to include menthol in the 2009 Tobacco Control Act is not an excuse for the federal government to abandon regulation on menthol. However, where the government fails to pass laws and policies that prevent harm, litigation can compel action to protect health. Such was the case when various public health organizations came together to file lawsuits against the FDA for failing to meet its legal duties, such as establishing graphic warnings for cigarettes, a job that is mandated by the Tobacco Control Act. We applaud our partners for challenging the FDA's unreasonable delay to protect health and save lives. The litigation also raises the question, though, at what point will the FDA act on its own evidence and in accordance with the Tobacco Control Act to take actions that benefit public health and finally ban the flavor of menthol and mint in cigarettes like all other flavors? In the meantime, people across the country have been working tirelessly to see that menthol-flavored tobacco sales are restricted or completely prohibited in their communities through effective local law and policy. We've seen many amazing examples of this, from San Francisco, California, to Duluth, Minnesota, and communities in Massachusetts. These laws prohibit tobacco retailers from selling menthol cigarettes in stores. No state has done this today, but it certainly could to protect all of its citizens, regardless of what neighborhood they live in. Local and state governments can also restrict the location and number of places that are able to sell commercial tobacco products generally. The tobacco industry uses the retail environment to advertise menthol-flavored and other tobacco products, especially in predominantly African-American and low-income neighborhoods. So eliminating or limiting how many and where these retailers can be is an effective policy option as well. One way to think about this is reducing the number of menthol cigarette signs that a 10-year-old or a lifetime smoker that's trying to quit passes by on their way to their bus stop, job, or school. We see examples of this location and type restriction around the country, including the state of Utah and the city of Chicago. But of course, local governments can only pass evidence-based laws like this if they're not prevented by state law from doing so. This is why ensuring state legislation does not preempt local governments from passing public health regulation is incredibly important for health equity. So a lot of work has been done, but there are still so many people who live in communities with no protections from the tobacco industry's peddling of lethal addictive menthol products. We must seek justice and support evidence-based, effective law and policy regulating menthol products that prevent harm from occurring in the first place. If you'd like to know more about how laws and policies can prevent menthol-related harm in your community, you can call me or email me or go to our Public Health Law Center website, which is right there on the screen, for resources and information. But some of you or your families may connect with or have similar stories to the plaintiff's stories that I went over today, and may be interested in exploring litigation as an option for justice. While we at the Public Health Law Center do not directly represent individuals or classes of people, there are resources available for you, like the attorneys at the Public Health Advocacy Institute's Center for Public Health Litigation team, who worked on the Evans case and the U.S. Virgin Islands cases. So I hope this has been helpful, and I thank you for your time.
All right, now we're going to bring up my sister colleague, Dr. Valerie Yerger, who's a professor at the University of California, San Francisco, and is a co-founding member of the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council. And the three of us travel all over this country doing what we do. And we have lots of accolades, but we are both the mothers of two black men, big grown black men. So we're not trying to do anything that would put them in harm's way in the work that we're doing to save our people.
I'll be talking about Malia a little bit here. So where are we going with mine? Carol, where am I at?
This is out of order somehow. There, so we're going to have to back up, yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, good morning, everyone. We really appreciate you being here. Part of the work that we've been doing is trying to keep educating and keep this issue alive. So this is very important for us that you're here and helping to disseminate the information that we share. So we've talked a lot about the FDA, and the inaction of the FDA led to local policy actions. I'm not going to go through all the areas that have enacted local policies, but I do want you to understand that it has been a result of the FDA not taking any action. The local jurisdictions have gotten involved. It is at the federal level, through the FDA, that manufacturers can be told what can be put into their products. That is not something that local jurisdictions can do. What local jurisdictions can do is they can restrict the sales of these products. So do understand there's been an evolution. We got very excited when Chicago became the first jurisdiction to enact legislation by creating buffer zones around schools to provide this protective space around where kids were walking to and from school. That got picked up by Berkeley, California, primarily because that's where we're from, and we were able to initiate that. So we were very excited with the buffer zone. When Minneapolis decided to take a look at it, they realized that buffer zones wouldn't work for them because they didn't have any retail stores within a certain area of these schools. So they decided what would work best for them would be to exempt adult-only shops, so to restrict the sales to these adult-only tobacco shops. So we're going to talk about an additional evolution of this, which is what happened in San Francisco. So Carol, Phil, and I have been going around working with a lot of the national voluntaries, a lot of local folks. And I was actually approached by Stan Glantz at UC San Francisco. We had a new comprehensive cancer director who wanted to do something very innovative in San Francisco. So we were tasked with trying to do something around restricting the sales of menthol in the city of San Francisco. And it was when we approached our local supervisor, who's Malia Cohen, and I'll talk a little bit about her. We talked about the buffer zones. We talked about restricting the sales to adult-only shops, and then this whole idea about citywide bans came up. And so with our first meeting, Phil Gardner and I were in the meeting with her when we presented this, and we were expecting several meetings going back and forth, but it was in that initial meeting where she said, you know, we passed the sugar tax here in San Francisco last year. We've been inoculated. Let's go for it. Let's go for this citywide ban. And if we get sued, we've got the best attorneys here, so if not here, then where else? So let's just do it. And that was back in April of 2017 when she introduced her ordinance. And we had invited former supervisor to come today, but this is a very busy day for her. She's going to be honored tonight at a gala sponsored by the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, but we want to honor her for all the great work that she's done here today. So when she introduced this law, she was there with the vice mayor of Oakland, who wanted to take this up in Oakland. And also it's very important for you guys to know, as I am going to talk about one of the industry arguments about how banning menthol cigarettes increases the criminalization of black and brown men. You see that we stand here with our police chief of San Francisco, Bill Scott. So he was totally in support of this. We also went to our communities. We held community forums. We offered opportunities for our youth to get involved by sponsoring spoken word contests, giving our young people an opportunity to think about this issue and how their personal lives have been impacted by menthol. And so when you engage with the communities, they come out and support. And here's one of our spoken word artists. We call her 6-Footer, the poet Latasha Turner, who spoke at one of our press conferences when we announced the ordinance in San Francisco. We also had young people who came out and were very vocal about this issue. In San Francisco, one of the strategies that we knew was important to utilize was really the effect of e-cigarettes, because in San Francisco, even though we had a president of the Board of Supervisors who was black, who is now the mayor of San Francisco, London Breed. We had a black police chief. We actually only had like 3 or 4% of the population who were African American. So for us to move forward with this issue, we had to really collaborate with others who were burdened by flavored tobacco products. So that included standing with our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, standing with parents of children who were affected by the electronic cigarette flavor explosion. We also had the support of some of the local chapters of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. I'm a member of the sorority. I introduced a resolution through my local chapter, Berkeley Bay Area Alumni. This went to our national convention in 2013, and you'll see here that this is 2017. That's because we have 2 resolutions. It's the first time in the history, the 105-year history of our sorority, that we have 2 resolutions on the same issue. That is because of the understanding that the first resolution really was to say to the FDA, do something. Stop using menthol in cigarettes. And when it was clear that we weren't going to get any action, we realized that we had to go to the local level. We had a second resolution that supported local chapters and supporting local efforts. And they also are very helpful for showing up at city council meetings. We also worked, and Carol took this on through the Berkeley branch, Berkeley, California branch of the NAACP. This took us 10 years to do. So we don't have time to talk about all the things that we had to do to engage the community, but do know that you have to be there and you have to show up where the community is. And it means working late, it means working on the weekends, it means showing up and coming across as though you really care about the issues, and obviously we do, so they have to be convinced as well. But in 2016, at their national convention, the NAACP adopted a resolution, again supporting local actions to restrict the sales of these products. And this is Dr. Jonathan Butler. He is not only a professor at UC San Francisco, but he's a member of the San Francisco branch of the NAACP and was there at our press conference when we announced the launch of our, or the introduction of our ordinance. So on July 7, 2017, the ordinance was signed into law by our mayor then, Ed Lee. It became the strongest law in the country restricting the sale of these flavored tobacco products. And it was to become effective the following April 2018. But you know, when you get into what Carol likes to say, that industry's Kool-Aid, they're gonna show up. And they did. R.J. Reynolds, this is a very quick explanation of what happened, but as a result, the R.J. Reynolds came in and filed a referendum. What the referendum did was it put a stop to the ordinance and placed the issue on the ballot for the voters of San Francisco to decide. The Reynolds dumped almost $12 million to fight this San Francisco ban. This is the results of the election that took place. This is Proposition E. I think somebody made mention of that on June 5th of 2018, and you can see that those of us who were in support of the ban were victorious, 68% to 32%. I wanted to show this too. This, and it's effective as of May 17th. The numbers might be a little off, but this is to show that there are 17 other jurisdictions, mostly in California, that have enacted citywide bans as a result of what happened in San Francisco. This is how quickly this is going. And of course, we have a number of jurisdictions that had implemented ordinances that were maybe buffer zones, or they weren't quite citywide bans, and they're looking at going to amend their ordinances. But this seems to be the way that we're going, and we have a lot of good things to say about local efforts because they help to engage the local communities, the local coalitions as well, and it makes it more difficult to get interference from the industry. So I want to take a few moments to talk about the ongoing industry interference. And we didn't really get into why there's been such a huge focus on flavors and menthol in terms of the market, but do know that menthol sales are continuing to increase as the sales of regular cigarettes are going down. So the industry, for its survival, is feeling a need to really fight us and to keep a stranglehold on certain communities, which are the communities that we're talking about. But I do want to let you know that it's not always obvious when the industry's around. They know that they're not well liked. They know that the public doesn't trust them, so they rely very heavily on their so-called allies as front groups. And this is a 1984 Philip Morris document that talks about how using front groups gives them clout, and it gives them power, it gives them credibility, and I might add, it gives them invisibility as well. This is another 1984 document that talks about the importance of engaging with their friends, their front groups. And I just want to quickly say that it's really about their savings account. And they'll do things to make groups feel that they're loved and welcomed and liked because they're making deposits into those savings accounts, goodwill deposits, deposits of getting to know people, of listening to their problems, just deposits to gently bring them along about what our problems are and how our problems impinge upon their livelihood. So, and if you make those deposits into the savings account, when you really have to make a withdrawal, guess what? The bank balance is there. So there's no free ride for anyone that takes any sort of money or sponsorships or any sort of handshakes from the industry, none whatsoever. Back in 2002, my colleague Ruth Malone and I published a paper. This is a paper that came out of our research of the tobacco industry documents. I came to University of California, San Francisco in the late 90s. I'm a licensed naturopathic doctor. I was the first midwife licensed in the state of California. I had plans to have a clinical practice. I started seeing these documents and it was like, it's on. And we've been doing this for 20 years. We'll continue doing it as long until we can turn the light on. I see these young, beautiful people here, and I told you earlier today when I met you that you guys are our future. You have a lot of power. So you take the information that we have and you get out there and you spread the information, and that's the most powerful thing that we can do. But as a result of the documents research that we did, we were trying to understand why there was such a pervasive presence in African American communities. Practically every single major Black organization has some sort of history, some sort of tie with the industry. And so what my colleague Ruth Malone and I were able to do, we were able to document why the industry was building these relationships. It was not only to keep the tobacco companies looking like friends within the community and to keep African Americans engaged as consumers, but it was also to diffuse any sort of tobacco control opposition that was coming from within African American communities and to silence their leaders, as well as to get African American organizations to act as front groups. We wrote this paper back in 2002. And it's been a little bit quiet, but guess what? Because of the work that we're doing on menthol, and because of their prior relationships with African American leaders, this stuff is starting to come back to the surface, and I'm going to help expose what's happening. So one of the biggest arguments that we hear from the tobacco companies is this whole criminalization argument, that smokers will be penalized for possession of menthol cigarettes. What's been happening is that as jurisdictions pass these laws, they are sharing their ordinances. It's not a matter of people reinventing the wheel. They may tweak it a little bit so that it conforms to what they need to do locally, but for the most part, the content is very, very directly the same. And we have been very vigilant to make sure that the language is very clear, that any sort of penalties is at the level of the retailer, not at the user, not at the purchaser, so there is no penalty for having these products on your body. There's no penalty for using these products. I want you to be very clear about that. And no matter how people will stand in your face and say this, you have to stand firm. And I'm going to give you a reason for doing so. This has been considered a racialized issue because, oh, Black people smoke menthol cigarettes. Why are you going after menthol cigarettes and not going after all cigarettes? You may hear that. We are going after all cigarettes, but we're taking our time doing it because it's important not to leave marginalized people behind. And these flavored products give us an opportunity to get them on board. Otherwise, there's going to be an incredible gap between those who are protected and those who aren't. So that's why we're focusing on menthol. We're playing catch up because the FDA should have taken care of this back in 2009, and they did not do that. So they're making us work really hard. I'm here in Washington, D.C. instead of being with my grandchildren back in California. Hi, babies. So they talk about this being racialized. This is racialized. This is a 1987 document from Lorillard that talks about how the competition is centering their marketing efforts in the low-income Black communities. We wrote a paper on the racialized menthol wars because back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, tobacco companies aggressively competed against one another, and they did that in low-income Black communities. This is racialized. So, decriminalizing the Black community is the argument that we're seeing from groups that are acting as front groups for the industry, and I will show you why they're front groups. Carol Magruder and I were here in 2016. This is our second press conference here in Washington, D.C. We came hoping that we could get attention from President Obama, asking him to do one good thing before he left. It didn't happen, so we didn't give up. We're still here. But we went to the CBC annual meeting, and while we were there, we found out that there was a session on this whole decriminalizing the Black community. And if you take a look, you'll see the first thing is banning of menthol. So we went there, and that's where we got exposed to the fact that these gentlemen here had been going around the country already for I don't know how many years, but we just learned about them in 2016. At our press conference in 2016, Ben Chavis was there. I was sitting at the front, and I got excited. I'm like, there's Dr. Chavis. He's here at our press conference, unknown to us that he was there on behalf of the industry. So I'm going to call out a few of these individuals. This is John Dixon, and I'm seeing that my slide didn't really come out. I'm not sure what happened here. But he's a former president of Noble. Some of you guys may have heard of Noble. That's the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement. They've had a relationship, and what this document was to show just how long-standing. We're talking about the 80s that they've been involved with the industry. So that didn't work out. But anyway, here's another document that shows their tie to the industry. This guy here, Kendrick Meek, is a former U.S. congressman from Florida. He is a consultant for Reynolds. We were able to track that he's been paid $202,000. And granted, they're giving them this money to go around the country and talk about this whole criminalization argument. This is what they're getting paid for. Neil Franklin, who's with the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, LEAP, we've been able to track at least $100,000 in just a couple of years. Here's our buddy, Ben Chavis. He took $250,000 from Reynolds. And this money, he had taken this money several months before he showed up at our press conference, which was in September. This is a flyer that brought attention to the fact that Reverend Al Sharpton has been floating around with these individuals as well. And we know that he uses his national action network to have access to the community, to our Black leaders, to talk about the criminalization of menthol. And it shows that he was sponsored by RAI. Most Black folks don't know that's Reynolds American. I actually had this picture taken. I was in Oakland for one of Al Sharpton's talks. And I kept wondering, why is that white guy in the back with the suit on? He's just sort of lurking around. We were in a Black church in Oakland, California. And so this is a friend of ours who posed so that I could capture him. And it took me 4 hours to find his face on the internet, but what I discovered was that he was an executive vice president in consumer marketing for Reynolds.
And then Bishop Mario Gaines.
Let me set this up. So I'm going to share with you just very quickly. I know that we're running out of time, but it's important to know that the way that this works in terms of getting at the local level for these folks is they use people who are very well known. They use their faces, they use their networks, and then they go and they find local people and they pay them to show up at city council meetings. And they don't necessarily understand the issue. So this, I'm going to play a very short piece of something that you can find on the internet. It's all very public. At a hearing in Sacramento, which, by the way, has a citywide ban on menthol cigarettes. But this was earlier this year. This was at a hearing in March when one of the subcommittees was considering the ordinance. I couldn't get the video because they don't let you download the video, so just listen to the audio, and there's a picture of the speaker.
And then Bishop Mario Gaines.
Good afternoon. My name is Theron Giles, and I'm going to allot my time to Bishop Mario Gaines.
Actually, we don't do that, so if you'd like to speak, please go ahead. We don't transfer time.
I really didn't come prepared to speak, but my pastor always say, be ye ready also at all times.
I'm sure you are.
I'm pretty sure y'all know Dr. Ephraim Williams. Based on what I've heard, this flavored cigarettes, I'm not a smoker and I'm not a drinker. And they often tell me you don't know what it's like. And I don't want to know what it's like. But one thing I can say, that cigarettes is killing our young folks. I don't care if it's flavored, I don't care if it's a gummy bear, whatever it's put in, it's killing our young folks. I have children. I have 6 of them, 3 boys and 3 girls. And they all have had their challenges with cigarettes. And so I say to the cabinet, I stand against the ban of flavored cigarettes.
Okay, so that's him. I did not do anything to this. I'm sitting there listening to him, and I'm like, he's on our side. Why is he sitting with them? And then he talks about how he's against the ban. So unfortunately, we have to do the education. So he got pulled in, and that's what's happening. So be able to see that if you're out in your community, you're doing work, just keep your eyes and ears open. There's opportunities to educate. So I'm going to end very quickly here, but I just want to say, I think most people understand, or you should understand, that if you see a study and it has especially controversial findings, what should you do? You should look at who the funder is, right? I mean, we all kind of get that. And we know that there's financial conflicts of interest, and there's been a lot of research that has been well documented on if you take money from someone who's sort of commissioned you to do something, it's going to be very biased, right? So we know that there's widespread and harmful source of bias that is associated to any sort of financial relationship. And pharmaceutical, tobacco, food or chemical industry funding biases the outcomes that are favorable to the sponsor's product. And biases influence the framing of the question whether outcomes are fully and accurately reported. So when we're hearing our Black leaders who are telling us that the work that we're doing is going to put more Black and brown men in jeopardy, then they need to disclose that they're taking money from the industry so that we can decide whether or not we accept what they say. So I'm going to leave this here, but do know that restricting the sales of menthol and other flavored tobacco products will save lives. Thank you very much.
All right, excellent, Dr. Val. So we are winding down. I haven't forgot about you. We're going to bring you up last. I just want to, this is one statistic that I wanted people to see, this slide. And this just talks about, this was 10 years ago, but if a certain percentage of people quit smoking menthol, how many lives it would save. So there's a total U.S. population in the middle there, and then the Black population on the right. We should be, we're a tenth of the population. We should be a tenth of the larger number, and that's how you can really see how disproportionately we die from tobacco and how many lives would be saved if we could get rid of menthol. So we want to take head on the criminalization of Black folks. This is the Eric Gardner case, I Can't Breathe, that was a spark for the Black Lives Matter. This brother was choked and left to die in handcuffs in New York for allegedly selling loose cigarettes. And so we do want to take on unintended consequences, but we know what the intended consequences are. And our position is that we have to deal with police brutality. We have to deal with these officer-involved shootings. We can't wait and not enact good public policy that will help to save 45,000 Black lives until we get this other thing solved with what's happening with our police departments. We have to do both simultaneously. And we have a woman in the audience, former Baltimore City Councilwoman Helen Holton, who put this legislation forward in Baltimore during the Freddie Gray era time period. And so Chicago, Baltimore, cities that have these issues that have to be addressed, and we are working to address them. So this is Trayvon, Oscar Grant, and Jordan Davis. And I put the picture of Trayvon smoking because that was the picture that they put out to try to assassinate his character. He was playing around on his Facebook page as a teenage adolescent smoking. But this was the picture that was put out to position him as a thug. And this is Jordan with his father before he was killed in an officer-involved shooting. So we're not doing this work in a vacuum. This is a solution-oriented suggestion. This is Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt. She's a researcher out of Stanford, and she has a book called Bias. She's actively working with police departments, Oakland in particular, and has helped to reduce their officer-involved shootings through policy. So policies help, education helps, and holding people accountable is what we have to do. So these are the boys who we're working to save, who are forgotten. These are some Baltimore boys, Helen. These are some photos that I got during that time when we were there with you. And so this child who's throwing this rock, he's probably about 12 years old. He is clean, he is loved, and he was out when they were having all the incidents in Baltimore. But those are the children who we're working to save in our community. They are worth saving. And now I'm going to bring up Cianti Stewart-Reed, who's with the Truth Initiative, and they have had some of the hard-hitting media that you see all around the country. And she's just going to talk briefly about a campaign that they have right now, and then we're going to close this out with just a few questions and get out of here.
Thank you so much for having me here today. Good morning. It's an honor to be here to represent Truth Initiative and our work with the Truth Campaign and our many other programs to achieve a culture where youth and young adults reject tobacco. As my colleagues have shockingly and persuasively established this morning, menthol cigarettes are a grave threat to our nation's public health and the accomplishment of our mission. And menthol's properties are known to reduce the harshness of cigarette smoke, making them the perfect starter product for new smokers and young smokers. Perhaps that's why 54% of high school smokers use menthol. And while we've seen dramatic declines in tobacco use prevalence among adults and youth over the past decade, but as our speakers point out today, when we look at the data for menthol, a disturbing trend is revealed. And yet, action by our federal government, which has had the authority to act on menthol since 2009, has been as elusive as a wisp of smoke. Thankfully, today's generation of young people refuses to wait for others to act. My organization, Truth Initiative, understands their impatience with the status quo. In February, our Truth Campaign launched Making Menthol Black, a video that shines a spotlight on how the tobacco industry has targeted minorities for decades with menthol cigarettes. And we'll show you that now.
For decades, Big Tobacco targeted minorities with menthol cigarettes. Here's some of what they did. Identified and profiled black communities.
More than 75% of African American smokers use menthols.
Appropriated black culture. Flooded the neighborhood.
Can't get away from it. It's all around us.
This addiction was designed.
We grow cigarette volume, and that's all we did.
And today, 89% of African Americans.
Oh, no. So compelling, you get to watch it again. No, never mind. I'm going to stop pushing buttons now. It ends well. The video is available for state and local partners. So if you want to use this in your communities, we're happy to work with you to do that, to educate local policymakers about menthol. You can also find it online at Truth Orange on the YouTube page. Black Lives, Black Lungs is also a documentary that was produced by 2015-2016 Truth Initiative Youth Activism Fellow Lincoln Mondi. It's dedicated to investigating the successful targeting of the Black community with menthol products at the hands of the tobacco industry and how it's affected Black lives. We've been empowering young people also by funding programs to protect the lives of college students, faculty and staff at academic institutions around America. Our focus is minority-serving institutions, including more than 56 historically Black colleges and universities, and community colleges that often serve as a gateway to post-secondary education for first-generation college students, people of color, and low-income families, the very groups more likely to smoke, more likely to use menthol tobacco, and to suffer disproportionately from tobacco use and secondhand smoke. We're helping schools to establish tobacco-free policies through funding, education, and training. And change is happening. We partnered and provided funding to 183 colleges to date in 42 states and territories. Nearly 100 of our grantees have adopted policies to eliminate tobacco use on campus, impacting close to 1 million students and faculty. We're making a big impact on college campuses, but it's not enough. We need the FDA to finally ban menthol cigarettes, especially when you consider that they are nearly 1/3 of the cigarette market in the United States, and trends show menthol products are gaining market. We can and we must change direction and make a life-saving difference. Thank you.
I'm going to see if I can get to play the whole thing.
They did. Identified and profiled Black communities.
More than 75% of African American smokers use menthols.
Appropriated Black culture. Flooded the neighborhood.
Can't get away from it. It's all around us.
This addiction was designed.
We grow cigarette volume, and that's all we did.
And today, 89% of African American smokers use menthols. Know the truth, spread the truth.
All righty. Okay, so we are going to wind it down. Dr. Phil, would you join me? So we just want to thank all of our partners who stood with us, and also the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, and my love back there, Gustavo, from California. Thank you, and thank you, our audience. And if we have any questions, we'll take a few questions before we close it down. Anybody have any questions or comments?
I have a comment. Even though it wasn't said directly, when the going got tough in Baltimore, it was Helen Holton who stood tough and stood up in the midst of the Freddie Gray thing, the fight for black community, larger issue of the killing of black folks by tobacco products. Helen, you were a warrior, and we salute you for it, and I want to thank you for coming here today.
Okay, so what is the ask? What do we want? We want our leaders to be Helen Holton, to be Malia Cohen, to take the lead, and to have a plan for the #1 killer of black people, to keep it in our top 5 priorities, to advocate and make sure that our people get services, cessation services, services that address the social determinants of health, stress, why people smoke in the first place. And we're going to ask Napton, who is our, with Del Monte Jefferson, I call him our counselor because he's very even-tempered, to convene a meeting, a public dialogue with us and with other African-American people who are on the other side of this question, because it's a conversation and we need to have it. The tobacco industry is not welcome at the table. They cannot help us figure out how to get out of this, because they are the cause of it, and they are federally adjudicated racketeers. We want our leaders to stop socializing with them, accepting their money, and that you can't serve two masters. You cannot serve two masters. And so we need our leaders to be to honor that and to be in this fight with us all the way. We shouldn't have to go and beg people to be on the side of this. They should be the ones who are taking the lead. That's what leaders do. They take the lead. So we're based in California. We're available to come all over the country. We've been all over the country. We're bringing Laurent and Ash to California to help us to infuse these issues as we fight for the policies. We know that tobacco control is a grassroots fight. It's a street fight. It's city by city. And the higher up you go, the more likely that things are going to be derailed and there's going to be more tobacco industry influence. So we are doing that in California now. Chicago was the first city. We thank Rahm Emanuel. We have a new sister who's the mayor of Chicago now. Amen. But we thank Rahm Emanuel because he was bold. He was the first person, the first city to get out and to do anything about menthol, and then he litigated it. So we've been able to ride under the broad shoulders of Chicago, and it's just creating a tidal wave across this country. And so we encourage local municipalities to take it on. It's not an easy fight, but it's a fight. Nothing worthwhile is easy, so we need to just get on with it. Thank you. And can we take a group photo with all of the presenters? And Helen and Amber, too. Helen, come on.